Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Towers, and I'm a psychotherapist. Been practicing for the last 15 years, and I'm in private practice here in Kelowna. I'm a certified supervisor with 3 national associations and 1 provincial association. I'm also a supervisor of supervision, meaning I train supervisors with BCACC. I'm an author, having recently published a textbook and workbook called A Non-Pathologizing Approach to Counseling. Apart from seeing clients, I am actively supervising clinicians and practicum students. I train clinicians on how to approach this work from a non-pathologizing perspective, and I'm a professor at the University of Guelph. I was born in the Okanagan, and I have been with my partner for 32 years. Together we have 6 children and 5 grandchildren. And so today, by way of an introduction, I wanted to talk to you about what a non-pathologizing approach to counseling is. And to do that, I need to give a bit of a history on psychotherapy. So psychotherapy, over the last 100 years, was born out of the medical model. And the medical model is based on pathology quite intentionally because of all the medical professions were trained on treating the symptoms, putting the interventions in place in order to treat those symptoms. But when it comes to psychotherapy, taking that same training from the medical model becomes problematic, and we end up pathologizing the client, or to say a different way, we end up perpetuating harm to the client. Now, a non-pathologizing approach to counseling isn't a new idea. We can look back over the last 100 years and we can see some very distinct leaders in our profession that have brought a non-pathologizing approach into their work. We can look at Carl Rogers, known as what we reference nowadays as the client-centered approach. We could look at Viktor Frankl and his work with logotherapy. We could look at Michael White and his work with narrative therapy. And we could look at Richard Swartz and his work with internal family systems, all as examples as a non-pathologizing approach to counseling. What is somewhat problematic with this is that the non-pathologizing approach, as I've just mentioned, are sort of rooted in each of those therapy interventions. And so what I'm proposing is a non-pathologizing approach that can be applied to any modality that the therapist is using. Why this is important is the purpose of my work is to bring about the word that I use as a translation to what would classically be known as a pathology approach to counseling. And so what this means is that therapists can train on a new way that will bring what I've called a translation to this medical model approach to working with mental health. I wanted to bring forward this work because I want to help tear down the stigma around mental health and the idea that comes up with the difficulty in trying to find the right therapist and trying to find a resolution to life's difficulties, those disruptions that we find in our life. And often what we find is we have clinicians that are doing great work, but they're rooted in that medical model and that pathology, and the interventions that they use end up perpetuating pathology, meaning they end up communicating to the client that in some way they are the problem. And here lies the very first idea around non-pathologizing that I want to talk to you guys about. And it's this idea of the intrinsic worth of the client. And it really helps position the therapist in a way that the client is never going to be the problem. The problem is always going to be the problem. And so what we have here is this idea of a new way of sitting with our clients. And why I wanted to start with this idea is not just to empower clinicians, that there is a perspective that we can bring to our work to translate those favorite modalities that we're trained in and those favorite interventions that we've used, but also to empower the general public that there is a different way to show up for therapy. And often what I hear from people that I'm training and supervisees and also from my clients is that at some point, perhaps the therapist gets stuck in their work with the client. The pathologizing language that can come out of this that is often showing up in case notes is this idea of the client is resistant to treatment. And of course, we can see how pathologizing that is. And from the client's perspective, they come in entangled in with their problem and the life's disruptions, and they're looking for some sort of relief to their mental health angst that is bothering them. And the last thing that they want is to be able to leave the session feeling like they are the problem. And so this is to help everybody understand that there is a different way of showing up in the counseling room, and that's a non-pathologizing approach to counseling. So in my textbook, I have outlined 10 principles and 5 theories that underscore these 10 principles. I refer to these 10 principles as speed bumps, in a way that what that does is it allows the clinician to slow down in their work with the client. It makes sure that the clinician is checking in with theirself and checking in with what's happening in that counseling room in order to make sure that they're not going down what potentially could be a pathologizing path. And so in the brief moments that I have here with you today, I wanted to introduce you to a couple of these ideas and something for you to look for as you are looking for a therapist, practicing from a non-pathologizing perspective. So the first one I want to address is the intrinsic worth of the client. And I really want to emphasize this idea, as I just briefly mentioned a moment ago, of the client is never going to be the problem is the problem. Now, that sounds really nice to say, but as we sit with our clients for the very first time, as they come into that space with us, what this invites the therapist to do is be aware of their own presuppositions. As Kimberly Crenshaw talks about in her work around intersectionality, to be aware of our privilege, to be aware of all of these biases that show up in our work. And meaning that when the client shows up, it doesn't matter how they show up, it doesn't matter how they appear or what they talk about. We recognize intrinsically that they're never going to be the problem. And this is really important because as I review case notes based on the medical model, and as we've all been trained as clinicians, there's mention in those case notes of the client is disheveled, the client was late for their session, these types of pathologizing ideas that show up in case notes. And so a non-pathologizing approach really pushes back against those ideas and works to minimize that power differential between the therapist and the client. So if we don't see the client ever as the problem, what does that sort of look like as it shows up in therapy? And so I'll use a common example of someone who's showing up and they're feeling some disruption around the problem of anxiety. And so as a non-pathologizing practicing clinician, we would want to identify anxiety as being separate from the person. They're still experiencing disruption from it, but how we situate ourselves with the client, talking about the client's relationship to anxiety and beginning to use this type of language that untangles the client from anxiety right from the very beginning. What we're doing is we're recognizing that the client's never going to be the problem. The client's never going to be anxious or anxiety living within that client. Anxiety is something that is interfering and is disruptive in the person's life. And so what that does is that allows the therapist to align themselves collaboratively with the client, and they can work together on solving this problem of anxiety and its disruption in its life. This takes me to another principle that I've called the puzzle analogy. And so if you can imagine you're sitting at a table and across from you is the client and then the therapist. And in the middle of the table is a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And so the therapist and the client are working together on this jigsaw puzzle, but the only difference is there is no box top. So neither the therapist or the client has any idea what that picture is going to be. ultimately, this puzzle is going to represent the client's ideal narrative. And so what happens with this puzzle analogy is it slows down the therapist. Instead of taking the lead from a place of expertise or a sense of power over the client, what ends up happening is the therapist is working collaboratively. So if you can imagine working on a puzzle, say the client is recognizing a whole bunch of different colors and textures that they are interested in the moment. And so the therapist finds a similar color and a texture and offers it to the client to see whether or not that's a good fit. This idea, this practical sense of working together on a jigsaw puzzle illustrates the type of work that a non-pathologizing therapist does with their client. The other principle that I would like to introduce is this idea around limits, evaluations, values, timelines, measurements, assessments. There's a lot of words there, but these are words commonly used that we've all been trained on as therapists within the medical model. And when we transfer these ideas and these skills into our work with mental health, what we end up doing is perpetuating a pathology potentially, because what happens is that we're bringing a pre-described, constructed narrative around what is right and what is wrong. There's this morality attached to these types of ideas. And just as one example, when we look at cognitive behavioral therapy, we have something within that profession that is called a maladaptive behavior. And so what that is that the clinician is trained to identify behaviors that the clients use that the clinician identifies as maladaptive, poor, harmful in some way. And I hope that we can begin to see how these can potentially be pathologizing and perpetuate harm to the client, because that assessment of that behavior is done outside of the context of the counseling room. It's been pre-constructed by the profession and by that particular modality, and they have determined that a particular type of behavior is wrong. And so what we've ended up doing is moralizing people's thoughts, people's behaviors in this pre-described sort of way, and we bring those assessments and those judgments right through the medical model into the counseling room. So again, I'm hoping that you can see the non-pathologizing approach here, where we step away from those ideas and we work actively to deconstruct those larger social narratives of pathology that are impacting the client. The last principle that I would like to bring up is this idea of focusing on the process and not the content. And as I work with other clinicians on this, basically what this is with the medical model, we're trained to track with the symptoms, which would be the content, instead of being curious around the client's relationship to those symptoms. So there's a distinct difference here. And so that difference is that if we focus on the content that our clients bring to their therapists, what we end up doing potentially is assessing that content, pathologizing that content, and it removes our ability to remain in a place of curiosity and not knowing in our work with the client. And so this idea of focusing on the client's relationship means that we're deriving meaning from the client. And understanding the client's meaning of their life circumstances and those disruptions that they're experiencing in their life is critical in the treatment of their presenting problem. So the idea behind a non-pathologizing approach is to align ourselves with the client in a very authentic, collaborative way that removes any hint of pathology, that it empowers the client, it respects their autonomy, and it separates those larger social narratives that will instill a pathology or a harm to the client. We step in between those narratives and the client, and the work that we end up doing helps find them freedom from life's disruptions. Thanks for your time today.